Nurse Sarah Kessler had spent 2 years at Brightwater Regional being underestimated in every quiet way a hospital could manage without ever saying it outright. Then, a dying SEAL grabbed her wrist in a trauma bay, said one word nobody else understood, and every person on her team went completely silent. Sarah started at Brightwater 2 years earlier, 32 years old, unremarkable in appearance by design more than accident, the kind of nurse who moved through a shift without drawing attention to herself. She kept her sleeves long, she kept her answers short. She let people believe whatever quiet story suited them. Dr. Michael Rainier, the trauma unit's senior attending, had decided early what that story was. "She's competent enough for the basics," he told the charge nurse during Sarah's 3rd month, not lowering his voice enough to avoid being overheard. "Community college nursing program, no specialty certifications beyond the minimum. I wouldn't trust her with anything complicated." Charge nurse Denise O'Coffer had raised an eyebrow at that, but said nothing. Not yet. Rainier's assessment hardened quickly into department policy. Sarah got the stable patients, the overnight monitoring, the post-op checks nobody worried about. Anything requiring real trauma leadership went to Rainier's preferred residents, regardless of actual competence. "Kessler, can you handle vitals on the recovery floor tonight?" Rainier asked one evening, tone carrying the particular condescension of someone who'd long since stopped considering alternatives. "Keep it simple. I think that suits you." The younger residents chuckled, absorbing his assessment as established fact rather than opinion. Sarah nodded once and walked toward the recovery floor without comment. What none of them noticed was the way her eyes swept every room for exits and equipment the moment she entered, the way her hands moved with an economy that came from doing far harder things under far worse conditions, the way she carried herself like someone accustomed to responsibility on a scale none of them had ever considered. She kept a small, folded flag in her locker, never displayed, tucked beneath a jacket that never left the bottom shelf. By her 2nd year, the department's assumptions about her were unshakable. New residents were quietly warned not to expect much from the quiet one on nights. Rainier routed every complicated case away from her by habit now, without consciously deciding. "Kessler, just keep the routine patients stable tonight," Rainier said one Thursday, with the practiced patience of someone speaking to a subordinate several tiers beneath him. "Leave anything complex to me." "Understood," and Sarah returned to her charts before her expression could give anything away. Nobody in that hospital knew that the woman being handed routine vitals checks had once served as a Navy trauma nurse embedded with a special operations medical team, decorated for valor under conditions that made hospital politics look almost quaint by comparison. Nobody knew her quiet wasn't the absence of authority. It was authority so thoroughly internalized it no longer needed to announce itself. They would find out. Just not yet. The call came in at 11:20 that night. A multi-vehicle collision on the interstate, 4 patients incoming, 1 critical with penetrating trauma consistent with a workplace accident involving heavy machinery, though something about the wound pattern would later prove far more complicated than the initial report suggested. The ER erupted into motion. Denise rattled off assignments fast. "Torres, Bay 1. Rainier, you're primary on the critical. I need runners on standby." "And Kessler?" Torres asked. Denise glanced toward the recovery floor. "Keep her on the stable patients. We need people who can move fast on this one." Sarah said nothing, simply positioned herself near the supply cart, watching the doors. And then they burst open, and the chaos that followed made a mockery of every assumption in that assignment sheet. The critical patient was a big man, muscular even beneath the blood and torn clothing, chest wound bleeding heavily, blood pressure crashing with every passing second. He was fighting consciousness, muttering fragments that made no clinical sense. "BP's 60/30 and dropping," the paramedic shouted. "We can't get the bleeding controlled, and he keeps fighting the restraints even half-conscious." Rainier moved in immediately, hands fumbling with dressing placement, his voice climbing with the specific panic of a man more comfortable directing others than doing hands-on work himself under real pressure. "I need another set of hands, now," he snapped, scanning the room. Torres was mid-setup elsewhere. The junior staff hovered, unsure. out their depth. His eyes landed, reluctantly, on Sarah. "Kessler, get in here." Sarah didn't hesitate. She crossed the room fast, and the moment her hands touched the wound, something in her shifted entirely, the quiet, deferential posture dropping away, replaced by something sharper, faster, absolutely certain. "Wound tracks wrong for machinery trauma," she said, already repositioning the dressing with practiced, unshaking hands. "This is a penetrating wound. Entry and exit both clean. This is a gunshot wound, not a crush injury." "That's not what the initial report said." "The initial report was wrong," Sarah said, applying pressure with controlled force. "I need direct pressure here now, and someone needs to notify security this might not be an accident scene." Rainier, startled by the sudden authority in her voice, hesitated. And in that hesitation, the patient's hand shot up and grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength for a man in traumatic shock. His eyes, unfocused moments before, found her face with sudden, startling clarity. "Trident," he said, voice barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. The room went still. It wasn't a random word. It wasn't delirium. Sarah knew instantly from the specific weight and cadence of it exactly what it meant. A recognition code used within a very specific, very small community of people who had served in a very specific kind of unit. "I hear you," Sarah said quietly, her own voice dropping into something low and steady that nobody at Brightwater had heard from her before. "You're safe. I've got you." "Copper," he mumbled, eyes struggling to stay open. "I remember your voice from the briefings." Sarah's jaw tightened for half a second, so brief that nobody but the most attentive observer would have caught it. Denise caught it. "BP still dropping," Torres called out, snapping the room back into motion. "We're losing him." "He needs a chest tube and blood now," Sarah said, already reaching for the kit, hands moving with a precision that made Rainier step back involuntarily. "You are not authorized to direct trauma protocol," Rainier said, though his voice had lost his earlier certainty. "With respect, Doctor, he's dying while we argue about authorization," Sarah said, already finding the space between his ribs by feel, the same controlled, practiced motion of someone who had done this hundreds of times before in conditions far more hostile than a lit hospital bay. The needle went in. A hiss of trapped air escaped. "Sat's climbing," Torres called out, disbelief plain in her voice. 71, 79, 86. "Chest tube next. This buys minutes. Someone assist me." Denise moved to her side without hesitation, snapping open a sterile kit, watching Sarah's hands work with a precision that had nothing to do with basic or simple or nothing complicated. "Where did you learn that?" Denise asked quietly, unable to stop herself. "That's not standard technique. That's field trauma." "Training," Sarah said simply, not looking up, entirely focused on the patient's chest. But Denise had a nephew who'd served 2 tours overseas, and something about the calm, the counting by feel instead of measurement, the absolute absence of hesitation, nagged at her in a way she couldn't yet name. The patient's grip on Sarah's other hand tightened again, weaker now, his eyes fighting to stay open. "Trident," he said again. "Tell them. Tell them what happened to Reyes. They need to know it wasn't an accident. Same people who—" His voice faded, consciousness slipping. "Stay with me," Sarah said, voice firm but gentle, her free hand never stopping its work. "Who is Reyes?" asked Rainier, watching the exchange with growing confusion. Sarah didn't answer immediately, focused entirely on stabilizing the bleeding, on watching the monitor numbers climb back towards something survivable. "Pressure stabilizing, 90/60 and holding." The immediate crisis eased, the patient sedated and stable enough for transport to surgery, and only then did Sarah straighten, breathing out slowly, the kind of breath held for 2 long years. "Who was that man to you? And who is Reyes?" Sarah looked at the gurney disappearing through the surgical doors before answering. "His name is Mitchell Voss, retired Navy SEAL. I served alongside him and his team for 3 deployments as their combat trauma nurse. Reyes was another member of that team. He died 8 months ago, and what everyone was told was a training accident." "And you don't think it was?" Rainier said slowly. "I didn't think anything. Sarah said. "Until tonight, when a man who should be unconscious grabbed my hand and told me otherwise with his last clear thought before surgery." The hospital board called it a review of unauthorized clinical override and incident classification dispute. Sarah called it what it actually was: an inquiry into whether she'd be punished for correctly identifying a gunshot wound that had been misclassified as an industrial accident, potentially by design. She sat across from the hospital's chief medical officer 3 days later, a hospital attorney beside her checking his phone, alongside a stone-faced investigator from Naval Criminal Investigation Service who had arrived within hours of being notified. "You overrode the attending physician's initial assessment and directed trauma protocol outside your authorized scope," the CMO said, reading from a file. "You also made an unverified claim connecting this incident to a prior death under military jurisdiction. That's a significant liability concern on multiple fronts." "The wound pattern was inconsistent with the reported mechanism of injury," Sarah said evenly. "That wasn't a claim, that was an observation any trauma-trained professional should have caught." "With respect," a voice said from the doorway, "she's right, and I missed it." Rainier stood there, uninvited but present anyway. "I initially classified the wound based on the paramedic's report without examining it myself closely enough. She corrected me within seconds, and she was right. I've reviewed the case since. There's no version of that night where my judgment outperformed hers." The CMO's eyebrow lifted. "That's a significant statement, Doctor." "It's an honest one," Rainier said. "I spent 2 years deciding a woman was unqualified for complex trauma work because her file didn't have the pedigree I expected. Tonight, she caught something that could have let a homicide be filed away as an accident." The NCIS investigator, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Nurse Kessler's service record confirms she served with the same Special Operations Medical Support Unit as the patient. Her assessment tonight aligns precisely with preliminary findings we've been quietly developing regarding the death 8 months ago. We'd like her full statement, and we'd like to thank her for catching what almost got buried a second time." Denise, asked to attend as witness, spoke next. "I want it on record that we built an entire departmental assumption around her competence before we ever really watched her work. That's on all of us." The attorney cleared his throat. "This still doesn't resolve institutional liability concerns." "Then reframe the question," the investigator said flatly. "Without her catching this tonight, a second death connected to what we now believe is a deliberate pattern might never have been properly investigated. I'd call that considerably more valuable than a protocol technicality." The room went quiet. The CMO closed the file slowly, her tone shifting from procedural to something closer to respect. She said, "I'll take this under full review. Off the record, thank you for what you did tonight." "Take your time," Sarah said calmly. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until this is resolved properly, for Reyes and for Voss both." The review might have ended there quietly, if not for what happened 5 days later. The NCIS investigation, moving faster now with Sarah's statement and the corrected wound classification as evidence, identified 2 individuals connected to a private contracting scandal that both Reyes and Voss had reportedly threatened to expose before Reyes's death and the attempt on Voss's life. Those individuals, realizing the net closing around them, made one final desperate attempt to silence the only surviving witness, arriving at Brightwater Regional armed, intent on finishing what was started on the interstate. Security caught it on camera first. 2 men moving toward the surgical recovery wing with clear, coordinated intent. "Lockdown!" the security chief's voice cracked over the radio. "All non-essential personnel to shelter positions immediately." Sarah, checking on Voss's post-surgical recovery, heard the alert and did not retreat. She moved instead toward the corridor between the threat and her patient. "You need to get clear, Kessler," a tech said, already pulling other patients toward a supply closet. "They've got weapons out there." "I know. That's exactly why I'm not leaving this hallway open for them to walk through unchallenged." The men rounded the corner moments later, weapons raised, demanding to know Voss's room number, voices carrying the particular ugly calm of men who had already decided how this would end. Sarah stepped into view before security could fully engage, hands raised, voice dropping into the same low, absolute calm she'd used on Voss's wound hours earlier. He's already given his full statement. Killing him now accomplishes nothing except making your own situation exponentially worse. NCIS already has everything he told me. You're not protecting anything anymore. You're just deciding how many charges to add to what's already coming. You don't know anything, one man snapped, weapon trembling in an unsteady grip. I know exactly what happened to Reyes, Sarah said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. I know it wasn't an accident, and I know you're both about to make the exact same mistake he tried to warn people about. Put the weapons down, not for me. For whatever chance you still have to walk out of this as something less than what you're about to become. The weight of her stillness, so completely at odds with their rising desperation, seemed to physically slow the moment down. It's already over, Sarah added quietly. The only thing left to decide is whether it ends with more blood or without it. The first weapon lowered, then, reluctantly, the second. Security moved in fast but controlled, following Sarah's steady hand signal not to escalate, and both men were taken into custody without a single shot fired, without a single further injury to anyone in that corridor. The hospital board, informed within the hour, arrived the next morning to a version of Brightwater Regional that had changed overnight in ways no policy memo could have engineered. The chief medical officer stood before the full board and read from a report entirely reframed from where it had started 5 days earlier. Nurse Sarah Kessler, former Navy combat trauma nurse attached to Special Operations Medical Support, decorated for valor across 3 deployments. In the past week alone, she correctly identified a misclassified homicide, provided critical evidence in an active federal investigation, and de-escalated an armed confrontation targeting a surviving witness, all without a single additional casualty. She looked up. This board owes Nurse Kessler a formal apology for 2 years of documented dismissiveness toward a highly decorated veteran, and announces immediate changes to how this hospital evaluates clinical competency, based on demonstrated ability, not assumptions drawn from an incomplete file. Rainier requested a private meeting with Sarah that same week, not to defend himself, but simply to apologize plainly. I decided who you were within months of meeting you based on nothing real, he said. That's entirely on me. I'd like to learn how to actually evaluate people properly if you'll teach me. I will, Sarah said, but it starts with watching first, judging never. Denise requested to be permanently paired with Sarah's shifts, calling it quietly the most honest education she'd had in years of nursing. Mitchell Voss, recovering steadily under Sarah's continued care, gripped her hand again one final time before the NCIS investigation concluded, this time not in desperation, but in gratitude. You heard me, he said quietly. When it mattered most, not everyone would have. I always hear my team, Sarah said, even when nobody else is listening. And Sarah Kessler, once dismissed as unqualified for anything complex, was offered the hospital's new trauma investigation liaison position, working directly alongside federal and military investigators on cases requiring exactly the expertise everyone had spent 2 years assuming she didn't have. She accepted only once it came without ceremony, exactly the way she preferred to be recognized. 2 months later, Brightwater Regional looked much the same on the surface, but something underneath had shifted permanently. New hires were trained differently now. Nobody assumed a quiet file meant an empty one. Nobody dismissed a colleague's expertise without first testing the assumption against reality. Rainier ran his new evaluation protocols with a humility that had cost him nearly everything to learn. Denise trained incoming staff with a phrase she now repeated constantly. Competence doesn't announce itself, so ask before you assume it isn't there. And Sarah Kessler still moved through that hospital quietly, still didn't raise her voice, still didn't need to. Because everyone in that building finally understood what one dying man's grip on her wrist had proven in a single word. Some bonds are forged in places nobody else will ever see, and they hold long after the uniform comes off. The truest recognition rarely comes with applause. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, at the worst possible moment, from someone who remembers exactly who saved him once before. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's simply where loyalty waits, patient and unshaken, until the moment it's needed most. And the ones who are underestimated the longest are often the ones a dying man trusts before anyone else in the room. The end. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.